What's the secret then to disagreeing without dividing? I want us to find 3 secrets today to doing just that, to being able to disagree in our relationships and not to divide, to stay in good and healthy relationships even when we might have profound disagreements. And I'm convinced that these are the keys to unlocking that ability to be able to disagree without dividing. Can we find a way to hold different views and opinions and to disagree but remain together? Can we remain together in community? Can we do division differently? And you see, our world is encouraging us to do that because that's how you get people to look at your stuff. That's how you get people to donate to your cause, by creating fear and anxiety and division. We are being pushed into more and more extreme reactions. And I think it's really, really worrying. And I want to ask the question, is there a better way? Because if we don't find a better way, then the consequences of the road that we are heading down is catastrophic. It's catastrophic for our relationships. It's catastrophic because it leads to polarization, to breakdown of community, to division and to conflict. And I want to ask the question, is that what we really want? And is that what you really want in your relationships? Can we find a way to disagree, but to disagree without dividing? Because disagreement is unavoidable. You know, inevitably in any relationship, we will find that we disagree sometimes. Disagreement is unavoidable, but division is not. Disagreement is not often a choice. But division is. We can choose what to do with that disagreement. What's the secret then to disagreeing without dividing? What's the secret to disagreeing without dividing? Well, I want us to find 3 secrets today to doing just that, to being able to disagree in our relationships and not to divide, to stay in good and healthy relationships even when we might have profound disagreements. And I'm convinced that these are the keys to unlocking that ability to be able to disagree without dividing. And these principles will help us, again, whether we would say we were Christians or not. And to find these 3 key principles, we're going to look actually to an ancient church that was in danger of dividing. And it was in danger of dividing because they were having disagreements. And we're going to go back and we're going to look at this church and we're going to learn from them. And we're going to look at the guy who set up that church and who spoke into that church at a moment where they were experiencing division and disagreement, and spoke into them about the ways to navigate through that. We're going to find the ancient wisdom of a Jesus follower who knew about division and disagreement and who knew how to encourage people into a different route than dividing. So I want to take you back. The date is around about AD 60. The place is a place called Philippi in ancient Greece. It was named after a whole load of springs, water springs that were present in that place. Philippi literally meant fountain or springs. And this place, Philippi, was the site of the very first church to be established in Europe. That church was established in around AD 50 when some of Jesus' first followers, and in particular a guy called Paul, traveled there, met a woman called Lydia, introduced her to Jesus. She became a follower of Jesus, and together they established that church. She was the first convert in Europe to Christianity, to being a Jesus follower. And the church was really strong. And 10 years after it had been established, things were okay for that church. In the face of extreme persecution, they had managed to establish this church, to get it going, to reach out with the love of Jesus to many others, and things were going well until a conflict arose. And now it was under threat because two prominent members of the church and co-workers with Paul in getting that church established had fallen into dispute. And their dispute had started to infect the rest of the church. So Paul writes to them to encourage them to not allow their disagreement to spill over into division. Disagreement in any group of people might be inevitable, but division doesn't have to be. And right before the section of this letter that we're going to look at today that Paul wrote to this church, right before the section we're going to look at, he's speaking to them about standing firm in the face of persecution. He's speaking to them about remaining true to the mission that God has called them to, even though the authorities of the day, the governmental authorities, were placing them under extreme pressure. You know, they've been working so hard to get this church established in the face of such difficult and testing opposition that Paul is saying, don't throw all that away because you have a disagreement now. Paul is saying to them, don't succumb to the destructive forces of disunity which will take you away from what you've been doing. Focus on what God is asking you to do, not on the disagreements amongst you. So Paul has been reminding them of that mission. And then he says this to them, and he connects this, and this is really important, he connects this to that reminder of the mission that they have been on. And he connects it with the word therefore. So in Philippians chapter 2, in the New Testament part of the Bible, it says this: therefore, if you have any encouragement from being united with Christ, if any comfort from his love, if any common sharing in the Spirit, if any tenderness and compassion. So Paul links back to this mission that the church has been on. And he's saying, look, what I'm about to ask you to do, you should be motivated by this grand mission that you've been on. He says, if you have any encouragement from being united with Christ, any encouragement from that, any encouragement from this grand mission that you've been called to, then do this. Make my joy complete by being like-minded, having the same love, being one in spirit and of one mind. If you take anything from this mission that you've been on, that Jesus has called you into, then be like-minded, be one in spirit and of one mind. I think these are really interesting phrases. Being like-minded, being one in spirit and of one mind. It doesn't mean agreeing on everything, but it does mean agreeing on the main thing. It doesn't mean agreeing on everything, but it doesn't mean agreeing on the main thing. Paul is saying, be united by the bigger picture, the bigger vision, the bigger mission that you've been on. Focus on what unites you, not what divides you. Focus on Jesus and the good news of Jesus. And let that be the motivation for your unity, the shared experience of what Jesus has done and what God has called you into. Be like-minded. Have a common goal. And you know, being like-minded is way more than simple agreement. Unity in and of itself can't be the final aim, because you can have unity amongst murderers and thieves. Being like-minded is more than that. It's about being joined together in this grand mission. So here's the first of these three secrets, these first keys to disagreeing well and not dividing. The first of them is focus on the big mission. What's the bigger picture here than the disagreement you find yourself in? When you find yourself in a disagreement with somebody else about something else, take a beat and ask yourself, what's the bigger mission here? Maybe with your partner, the bigger mission is about your family and the environment you're trying to build for your family. Maybe the bigger picture is about the things you do together or the way that you are together. If your disagreements and potential divisions come around family life, what's the bigger picture here? Is it the health of your family, the environment that you're raising your kids in, the dreams you have for the future. What's the bigger picture? With friends, what's the bigger picture? If you're finding yourself in disagreement with friends, what's the bigger picture here? Is it the support and encouragement you're able to give each other? The sense of tribe or your community that you're building? Is that the bigger thing that's more important than the disagreement that you have? At work, maybe it's the project you're trying to complete. At church, maybe it's the grand vision that you have to reach out into communities and localities with the good news of God and just how much Jesus loves people and what he's done. What's the bigger thing here? What's the bigger mission here? Paul goes on in the next few verses to say more. He says, do nothing out of selfish ambition or vain conceit. Rather, in humility, value others above yourselves, not looking to your own interests, but each of you to the interests of others. Paul is reminding people who are on the edge of division in this church because of the disagreements they've been having. He's saying, remember that there are other people involved here. Now, this is about the most countercultural thing that Paul could have been saying. It's about, or some of the most countercultural stuff that Jesus ever said. Value other people more than you do yourself. In Jesus' day, that was a hugely countercultural thing to say. And 2,000 years later, isn't it interesting that it is still one of the most countercultural things anybody could say in our culture, in the Western world, 2,000 years later, value other people more than you do yourself. How countercultural does that sound these days? How maybe quaint does it sound these days? You know, one of the criticisms of the Jesus ethic of valuing other people more than we do ourselves may be that it sounds old-fashioned and quaint. How are we doing at the opposite of that? Where our society and our culture preaches to us, think about yourself more than you do other people. How is that going for us? It's always one of the things that I find interesting when people say, well, Christianity sounds old-fashioned or quaint. I want to say, how's the opposite going for us these days? Where we see division all around us. I think it's the total opposite of quaint. I think it's revolutionary and would change everything, even 2,000 years after Jesus, if we could just do it. To value other people more than we do ourselves. And this is the second challenge, the second key to finding a way to disagree without dividing. Value the relationship more than winning the argument. Value other people more than you do being right. And that's a hard thing to do because we love being right, don't we? I am usually right. I say to my wife sometimes, if we could just start from the premise that I'm right, our relationship would be so much easier. That doesn't go so well. I don't say that. That's a joke. Oh, dear. that was a joke. She's right there. We like being right, don't we? And sometimes, if we're honest, we value being right more than we value the relationship that we're in. And we need to remember, too, that engagement is not endorsement. Just because we're engaging with people who might do things differently to us, who might hold different opinions to us, who might behave in different ways to us, engaging, being in a relationship with people doesn't mean we're agreeing with everything. It doesn't mean we're endorsing everything. It just means that we value people and we love people. And we're trying to live the Jesus way of valuing others more highly than we do ourselves. You know, Jesus himself did this all the time. He engaged with people and was in relationship with people who other people looked at and said, why on earth, Jesus, would you be associating with those kinds of people? It got Jesus into real trouble. But Jesus said, I value people. So the second principle is valuing the relationship more than being right. Thinking about other people more than we do ourselves. Now, the third principle, I think, helps all of us, but is mandatory for the Jesus follower. This is a mandatory principle. So if you're a Jesus follower, this is something that we must do. And Paul says to us that all of this becomes much easier if we keep our eyes fixed on the one that we are following. He says this in verses 5 to 7 or so. He says, in your relationships with one another, have the same mindset as Christ Jesus, who being in very nature God, did not consider equality with God something to be used to his own advantage. Rather, he made himself nothing by taking the very nature of a servant, being made in human likeness. And being found in appearance as a man, he humbled himself by becoming obedient to death, even death on a cross. Paul is saying to the Jesus follower, you have a role model here for how to do this. You have a role model for how to build healthy relationships. And that role model is Jesus. And Jesus served first and loved others first. He humbled himself because of that service and because of his love for others. He humbled himself even to death, to dying in the place of others, a miserable and painful death on behalf of other people. The Jesus follower has a role model here for how to value other people and do relationships well. And so this is the third principle. If Jesus would humble himself to love and serve others, so should the Jesus follower. The third principle, remember what Jesus has done. So 3 principles for how we can disagree without dividing. Let's focus and unite around the big mission. What's the big thing? What's the big picture in this relationship, in this church, in this bunch of friends, in this family? What's the big picture? What's the big mission? Second one, value the relationship. And the third one, if you're a Jesus follower, remember what Jesus has done and given for you and given for each and every one of us. How to disagree without dividing? Well, uniting around what is primary. As we focus on the mission, value and love people and remember what Jesus has done and follow the example of the one who gave everything for the sake of a relationship, for the sake of unity and uniting, not dividing.